Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to be joined again by Jacob Williams. You're most welcome, sir. Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you for having me again. It's great to be here once again.
Yep, it's great to have you back. Before we get to our topic, which is a very pressing social issue, I think, just to introduce you very briefly, for those who don't know you, Jacob is doing his PhD in political philosophy at the University of Oxford. And in addition to his academic work, he's the head of domestic policy at Pixel House, a UK think tank, which promotes a pragmatic approach to foreign policy challenges and workable solutions to the challenges of cultural diversity, as the website defines it. And your commentary has been published in many prestigious journals, including the American First Things, Academic Questions, The Critic, and other publications, and he's a regular guest on GB News, as well as the occasional guest here, of course, on Blogging Theology. Now, so in recent news, I want to share with you some headlines, basically, from probably the most widely read English language online newspaper in the world, which is the lovely Daily Mail. And I'm going to share with you a couple of headlines just to show you what we're going to be talking about. Here's one of them. So here we have Donald Trump, of course. London wants Sharia law. How London became, so there's a Daily Mail, quite recently, actually, about 4 or 5 days ago, the 25th of September. How London became the Sharia capital of the West, with fatwas, misogynistic Islamic courts, and blasphemy attacks on the streets, as Donald Trump takes aim at terrible Mayor Sadiq Khan. Now, I'm not going to go through this article in any depth, really, but I just want to, just a little point here where after some waffle about various matters, it helpfully informs the readers, i.e. us, about what Sharia law is. And it says, Sharia law, it refers to a body of religious law inspired by Islam's holy scriptures, including the Quran and Hadith. Hadith are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. That's fair enough so far. A 2017 Home Office review found 85 Sharia councils, which interpret this law to pass judgments. And these are known as hadiths, were operating in the UK, prompting the country to be described as the Sharia court capital of the West. Now, of course, this is completely wrong. They're not known as hadiths at all. These are, as the preceding paragraph correctly stated, these are the authentic sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. And the other article I'm just going to quickly share with you, also from the inevitable Daily Mail, which has these articles all the time. This is on the 25th of September. I am an ex-prosecutor, and this is the dark truth about the rise of Sharia law in Britain. Islamic courts have sprung up across our country, and this is how they trap vulnerable women. Now, you'd have to pay Daily Mail to read this lovely article. But I Googled this person, who I've never heard of before, and it turns out not only is she a Reform councillor, Reform is this right-wing populist party in Westminster, in Lancaster Gate here in London. She's also, I'm told, by yourself, Jacob, a self-described Muslim, which left me speechless when you told me that. Is that the case? She actually calls herself Muslim.
Very much believe so, and I'm not here to question anyone's faith or personal beliefs, but certainly you can point to problematic statements of this kind and wonder what's motivating this. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I don't mean to attack her personally, but I had no idea that she identifies as a Muslim, given that kind of rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric. But anyway, moving on from that, the purpose of this podcast, really, and why I really wanted to talk to you, as a very erudite social commentator and political analyst and political philosopher, is to actually get some sobriety, some moderation, some facts into what's really going on here about Sharia courts. Can you tell us the truth about Sharia courts? How do they operate, and what exactly do they do, Jacob?
Yeah, so the really important thing to understand is that actually in British law, they're not actually courts. So quite consistently, the media refer to them as courts, and it might be the case some of them actually describe themselves as courts, but they are not courts. So as I pointed out when I last spoke about this on GB News, we should really be referring to Sharia councils. So it's a very long-standing principle under English common law, which was then reaffirmed in legislation in the 1990s, that anyone, regardless of their religion or absence of religion, is allowed to try to resolve disputes voluntarily outside of court, right? So not using the official legal system, they can appoint basically anyone they want to arbitrate based on any criteria they want to reach an agreement. And if that includes faith-based criteria, then they're allowed to do that. And this is not also something that's unique to Muslims. There are Orthodox Jewish Beth Din, which serve a similar function, mainly dealing with rules around family, marriage, and divorce. Catholics have diocesan tribunals. Even the Church of England has certain tribunals for clergy accused of crimes in some cases. So it's not unique to Muslims, and they're not actually courts because they don't have any authority to enforce their judgment unless and except that authority comes from the users of the courts contractually agreeing to follow a ruling, but then that's the same as any other contract. So it's not.
It's not a parallel legal system. I've heard this language used. Oh, it's a parallel legal system. Sharia courts up and down the country. You know, London's the Sharia court capital of the West. All this is complete baloney. This is completely rubbish. This is no factual basis at all.
Yeah, that's right. They're not. It's not a parallel legal system. It doesn't function as one. It doesn't have any legal authority. No.
Okay, well, that's very clear, and that is the case. I'm sure that's absolutely true. There's still the question: why would you, as Muslims, why would we go to? Well, what is the jurisdiction? Obviously, not a legal jurisdiction, but what is the civil jurisdiction, for a better term, of the courts? Why would we go in the first place? What kind of issues or topics would we seek redress for?
Yeah, so numerically, by far the biggest case is questions of religious marriage and divorce and rules around those, which many religions have particular rules, and that's why Catholics have their own tribunals and why Orthodox Jews have Beth Din. There are also some cases where Sharia councils will deal with financial disputes to do with Sharia rules around money and business and trade, but most cases it's to do with personal status, marriage and divorce, and family affairs.
Right, so these are entirely voluntary, aren't they? Yes. No one's compelled to go to them, obliged. And Islamically, they don't have to go to these particular councils. Right. They can resolve disputes, informally amongst other community members and family members. There's no compulsion to do this. No.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, it certainly isn't any kind of mainstream Muslim opinion that you have to go to this official tribunal of any sort. And I mean, it's possible, and we don't have the full picture that in some cases maybe it's entirely possible that in some cases there are people maybe who don't know these are not courts. That's conceivable. It's possible that maybe there are certain kinds of pressure placed on people in some cases. These are legitimate concerns, but these are not it's still not a question that these are actually courts with legal authority and no one is obliged to use them. That's correct.
Okay, so you mentioned these Jewish religious tribunals known as Beth Din, and they allow individuals to resolve their disputes in a kind of similar way. Do they have a similar kind of jurisdiction and to do with divorce and marriage, and is that similar kind of issues?
Yes, so legally and also in terms of what people choose to use them for, I believe you'll find it's pretty similar. The legal standing of Sharia councils, Jewish, Catholic councils is basically the same. They function as voluntary tribunals, and I believe also in those cases it's primarily questions around marriage and divorce that they deal with, yeah.
Right. Well, one of the things that came up, there's a fascinating interview you did on GB News quite recently, and that's how I first came across your comments on this. The interviewer, I don't know what his name was, says that he seemed to find one of the things that were baffling or different about Islam. Why is Islam in the frame here, saying not Jewish religious tribunals or Church of England or Catholic, in his view, is because, I'm paraphrasing what he says, but he seemed to be saying that, we British people, religion is a kind of a personal, interior, spiritual matter. But in Islam, it's much more broad than that. It's to do with rules. That was the word he used. He stressed this quite disturbing word, rules, as if rules and religion don't really have anything to do with each other. And I thought that was an extraordinary admission. And indeed, he was right. That is how many people in Britain do perceive religion, as a private faith thing that you do in the privacy of your own home. It's not a public thing. It's not a system. It's not a deen, as we would call it in Islam. But the thing about that is, the Jewish understanding of life is very similar to the Islamic one, traditionally for Orthodox Jews, it is a deen, it encompasses all things. And even the Catholic understanding of faith also encompasses the social order, justice issues and peace, and all sorts of other issues as well. It's not just a privatized faith. So it struck me as a peculiarly lopsided analysis, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you said it very well there. Exactly. So, in Orthodox Judaism, there's the notion of halakha, which is their conception of revealed law, which serves a pretty similar function to Sharia in Islam. Christianity doesn't have the same emphasis on a specific religious, as it were, legal code, but certainly there's to say that Christianity doesn't have moral rules is pretty strange. And as you pointed out, the Catholic Church in particular has a very long tradition of articulating rules through its own canon law, which is not exactly the same as Sharia or halakha, because it's supposed to be separate from state or from like the temporal authority. But yeah, there are analogies in other religions, absolutely.
Yeah. So that leads me to the question, perhaps a naive question. If this being the case, and it is, why is there so much heat being directed at Muslims? Because it seems that objectively there's no basis for this. What we want to do in terms of resolving our disputes and seeking reconciliation and justice and so on is entirely compatible with the Beth Deans and Jewish religious tribunals or other bodies. So why are Muslims being singled out consistently? The papers like the Daily Mail, I've never, not that I read it regularly, but I suspect they would never single out Beth Deans, Jewish religious tribunals, for criticism using this kind of very dark language. They would never do that. Why this very biased treatment of these different groups, do you think?
Well, I think it's hard to start to explain this without, of course, pointing out that in general, among Christian or Jewish communities, there is a great deal more secularization than you see in the Muslim community, and in general, that's going to lead to a far smaller number of people who are actually engaging with these tribunals on a regular basis, and so they're a much more marginal part of their life. So that's one reason they might appear to be alien to people, and perhaps some of the language that is used by, well, not only by sort of commentators who are critical of these issues, but just in general, there might be a sense in which people perhaps use careless language in referring to Sharia courts, and then there are, I suppose it's easier people who then hear about this to go and find certain unusual, prominent examples that have been reported on widely of Muslims saying that there should be a different legal system, or it should take over the British legal system, which is not obviously the widespread view, and then extrapolating from that and kind of building a hysterical panic out of it.
Yeah, indeed. The other thing I want to ask about is, there are potentially, I mean, in any areas of life, real abuses that have taken place in Sharia councils, not because they're Muslim, but because people are involved and people do bad things sometimes. So you're advocating really not their abolition, of course, but their reform. So if I understand you correctly, I mean, so if you're advocating reform of Sharia courts, how would that be implemented? What kind of strategy do you have?
So at Pixel House, we did a lot of research on this, and as far as we can tell, there are really two complaints that have some basis in reality, that have some legitimacy. And the first complaint is it's possible that some people, especially if you imagine certain communities where maybe some people don't speak fluent English or have recently arrived in the UK, might think that these are actually courts. And so we think it's reasonable just to say, well, because they're not courts, just to make sure that everyone's aware of where they stand, they should inform people of this. So, for example, they shouldn't be allowed to use the word court in the name. And if someone is then seeking a ruling, they should have to proviso this by saying, just by the way, we're not actually a court, this is a voluntary process. So I think that's fair enough. And then the second thing, well, really it comes down to the same reform. But the second objection that might have some basis in legitimacy is that in some cases, maybe women in particular, but not only women, might feel pressured, perhaps by family members, to use tribunals of a certain kind. And again, it's reasonable just to ensure that they are making a genuinely free choice by ensuring that everyone who comes in is told, this is not the official legal system. You do have recourse to British law as well. It's up to you to voluntarily use this. That's your choice. It's perfectly, we think, fair to inform people of that when they use Sharia or indeed any type of voluntary tribunal.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I mean, I'll put a link to the Pixel House website below. It's definitely worth having a look at. Lots of interesting articles and papers and so on, as you suggest. Just a slightly different question, because I'm generally a bit confused. If Muslims want to marry, and they get married in the local mosque, niqab, is that recognised by British law?
Not automatically. So it will depend on whether the mosque has registered as a conductor of marriages, which may or may not be the case. So one of the things we did discover actually is that there's a certain percentage of Muslims who have been religiously married through a nikah in a mosque, but who believe that that was a legal marriage as well, but actually it isn't in those cases. And so there does need to be more information around this, around how this process works.
So you're saying if so a mosque can be licensed, if that's the right word, to conduct weddings like a church can, is that okay? So if it is, then obviously it can conduct legally recognized marriages then, that are recognized in British law, I mean.
Yes, it can. It depends. Yeah. Right. It depends on the mosque. And of course, even if it's not legally registered, you can, of course, then go to a registrar after the nikah and have that part done separately.
Yes, but in a church, if I went to my local Catholic or Anglican church and got married, then I wouldn't be required to go to a registry office afterwards, would I?
Yeah, I believe that's an artifact of the way that these churches have been established in Britain for a very long time. And I mean, the Church of England until a couple of centuries ago was the only conductor of marriages, as it was the state religion. And then when other churches were tolerated, they were then introduced into this sort of regulatory system whereby their marriages would automatically be registered as well. So I think that's a mostly historical thing. So
it's interesting that so if a Muslim wants to get married in a local mosque and a divorce was seen to be inevitable at the end of the day, you really have to find out whether or not you were legally married or not, depending on whether or not you could go to get an official formal divorce in law, or you could go to one of these Sharia councils. I mean, you'd really have to get to know the status of the marriage before you went to which body to deal with the divorce proceedings. I mean,
that's right. And of course, you may wish to do both. The Sharia council will be to arbitrate on the religious validity of the divorce, and then the legal part that will affect obligations in law regarding finances and children would have to be done separately. I think it's important people know when they marry, when they do a nikah in a mosque, that they know whether it's legally binding or not. And there is evidence people are sometimes unaware of this, and it's it is full information.
It's just confusing because, as I say, Christians can get married in a church, or Anglican church, and so on, and not have this kind of confusion in terms of the status of the wedding and the marriage and so on. Okay, just my last point really is more political. We've seen already, and we're not going to. Let me just get this back up on the screen again. This is not in any way meant to be a personal attack on this Layla Cunningham, who you tell me is calls herself a Muslim, but this phenomenon, she's not the only member of the Reform Party who identifies as a Muslim. I think this phenomenon of self-identified Muslims apparently employing the rhetoric of what I would call the far right, which is very hostile to Muslims, and the rising popularity of the Reform Party, which, according to recent opinion polls, may well form the next government of the UK. If we do go down that trajectory, it actually pans out, then I think Muslims are going to find themselves in an increasingly hostile political, cultural environment in the UK, even if some of their spokesmen are Muslim. And is that how you see it? Are you pessimistic about the situation of Muslims in the UK in general, or is it too soon to say? Or what's your feeling?
I think there are certainly a lot of things to worry about, and there certainly will be a lot of things to be worried about if and when Reform comes to power. I think I would make the point that I would rather have Reform in power with Muslims in it than Reform in power without Muslims in it. Not because I think that Muslims should enter Reform to go and kind of, as some conspiracy theorists say, sort of undermine it from within, but because I think that the simple fact there are people in Reform who consider themselves to be Muslim or are considered by others to be Muslim is going to have some kind of constraining effect on its worst instincts, and I think that's something that is of some value.
It's an analogy I don't think you would ever agree with, but I'm going to put it forward as a bit of a provocative analogy, but nevertheless it certainly came to my mind. In reading of German history in the 1920s, 1930s, there were some Jews who were passionate German patriots who did actually join the National Socialists. This is known in the early days, before they were kicked out, before they were purged. And there was one or two Jewish academics who supported National Socialism. And that's the analogy and it's just that them joining National Socialists didn't make much difference. Now, I'm not saying that Reform the National Socialists. This is a comparison you may reject, of course. But it's just simply by Muslims being present in a hostile environment doesn't necessarily in any way mitigate the effects of that political movement. Do you know what I mean? It might be a little bit naive to expect that might happen.
Sure. I mean, I think neither of us really know for certain. I would say, for example, when Nigel Farage said that he didn't want to, I think the words he used were something like, we don't want to alienate the whole of Islam or we will lose.
Oh, yeah.
I think the fact that there are Muslims in the party and voting for the party probably plays some part in his calculations there. And if it were the case that there was a simple kind of absolute line, there are no Muslims on the right at all, I think you might see worse rhetoric and potentially worse policies.
I thought Farage there had in mind more the global Muslim situation, Muslim majority countries, Muslim nations, rather than, I thought that's what he was referring to, rather than Muslims in his own party, or maybe.
My understanding of it was that he was referring to Muslims in Britain as well, not necessarily in his party, but I mean the fact that there obviously is one very prominent Muslim, Dear Yusuf, in his party, probably plays some part in his thinking.
Okay, my final question to you, Ray, is about your head of domestic policy at Pickthall House. Tell me a bit more about Pickthall House. Is it an Islamic think tank, or what is it? How would you characterize it in its role in society?
The way I would describe it is it's not a Muslim or an Islamic think tank, but it's a British think tank that is run by British Muslims. So what we believe is that we have a set of views on the challenges Britain faces that are the right views for Britain, but they are also the right views for British Muslims. And also that as British Muslims, we have a particular perspective on these problems that gives us a particular insight into issues inside of the community and ways in which these can be constructively engaged with, and Muslim opinions on global issues, and that this insight will allow us to contribute to policies that are going to be right for everyone.
Okay, so why Pickthall? Why this word? This is a name, obviously, of a famous. Was he a Victorian Muslim convert to Islam?
Yes, Marmaduke Pickthall was around in the late 1800s. I believe he died in the 1930s. And yes, I mean, he famously wrote one of the major English translations of the Quran as well. So it sort of symbolizes the congruence between Islam and what you might call a traditional British way of life.
Right, traditional British. So he was more traditional, more conservative, rather than socialist or left wing in his approach to British.
It's not about conservative versus socialist or left wing. It's just the idea that you could be fully Muslim and fully British.
Right, fascinating. Well, as I say, I'll put the link in the description below. Do check it out. I think that's all the questions I had. I'm very grateful for you coming on, Jacob, and giving these kind of reaction videos to the news. And you are regularly appearing on GB News, which I think you're probably the only regular Muslim commentator they have on. Is that right?
They do have one or two. Not quite the only one. Yeah.
Really? Yeah. Was anyone I noticed anyway? But thank you very much indeed for your time and your perspective. Very, very interesting. Take care. Until next time.
Wa alaikum salam.